You clicked on this video because you want to know why is Portugal so long, and why it looks so much like a rectangle with a bite taken out of it. To answer this question, we need to go back in time, all the way back 400,000 years ago, to look at some events that molded this country's vertical border. The first human inhabitants of Portugal were Neanderthals, who occupied the region about 400,000 years ago. But due to certain events, they were followed by Homo sapiens, just like me and you, about 35,000 years ago, who developed various cultures and technologies. In the following years, many different culture groups made their homes here through a mixture of both invading and settling the land. Some of these groups include the Celts, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, and more influentially, the Romans. In the 3rd century BC, the Roman generals Publius Cornelius Scipio and his brother Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus led an army of around 25,000 men and conquered Iberia, kicking out the Carthaginians, and occupied their territory for a meager 700 years. In the coming 200 years, the Romans gradually unified Iberia, founding colonies, forming alliances with some native tribes, and crushing the others. Decimus Junius Brutus Caecus was responsible for conquering western Iberia, and Gaius Julius Caesar, who aided in the conquest of Iberia by subduing Lusitania in the south, which encompasses modern Portugal and parts of West Spain, and Galicia, now known as Galicia, just north of modern Portugal. Throughout these conquests, the Romans who invaded, settled, and migrated brought their language, law, religion, roads, wine, and culture to Portugal, and left behind many monuments and ruins. However, the West Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD. Portugal was subsequently invaded by Germanic tribes who poured in from the north, such as the Suebi people and the Visigoths. The Suebi established a kingdom in Galicia, while the Visigoths ruled over everything else in the Iberian Peninsula and South France. Both people eventually converted to Christianity and adopted some aspects of Roman civilization. But like the Romans, their dominance was short-lived, as a new wave of invaders from the south arrived in the 8th century, and crossing the Strait of Gibraltar from Africa were 7,000 men, seeking the newly plundered lands of the Visigoths. These Muslims were part of the Great Umayyad Caliphate, a vast empire that stretched from the Atlantic to India. The invasion began in 711, when Muslim general Tariq ibn Ziyad, under the instruction of Musa ibn Nusayr, the governor of North Africa, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with a small army of Berber and Arab soldiers. His army killed and defeated the Visigoth king Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete. This marked the end of the Visigothic kingdom, which was toppled by just one battle. Tariq ibn Ziyad was then joined by Musa ibn Nusayr, who brought a larger army from North Africa, and together they conquered most of Iberia in a just few years, facing little resistance from the divided and demoralized remaining Visigoths. The peninsula was subsequently named Al-Andalus, under Muslim rule, and under the Umayyads, they appointed governors and judges to administrate the region and collected taxes and tribute from the conquered peoples. They built mosques, palaces, fortresses, roads, bridges, and irrigation systems, and encouraged trade and commerce with other parts of the Muslim world and beyond. But most surprisingly, they tolerated both the native Christian and Jewish natives and allowed them to live as free people. 30 years later, 750, the Umayyad Caliphate and family were all murdered and tracked down due to the controversial way that they ran the empire, which many Muslims said contradicted that of the teachings of the Quran. The Abbasid family took control, and all Umayyads were murdered, but one who managed to escape, Abd al-Rahman I. Abd al-Rahman managed to flee to Syria and traveled to Iberia and established his own autonomous kingdom and named himself the king of all Al-Andalus. However, since the Muslim invasion of Iberia in 711, not all Christians accepted their new Muslim overlords. Many rebelled or fled to the northern mountains and formed small kingdoms that resisted Muslim attacks. These kingdoms were Asturias, Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and Catalonia, which led to a series of offensive wars called the Reconquistas that lasted for almost 8 centuries, from 722 up until 1492. The Reconquistas were not only a military struggle, but also a religious one, as both Christians and Muslims fought for their faiths and is pivotal in understanding Portugal's long shape. The King of Castile formed an alliance with the King of Burgundy through a good old arranged marriage with his illegitimate daughter and granted the King of Burgundy the county of Portugal. The King of Burgundy and the daughter of the King of Castile had a son who they called Afonso Henriquez. However, put simply, the King of Burgundy died leaving Afonso Henriquez to rule, and he became the new Count of Portugal under his cousin Alfonso VII, King of Castile, and for whatever reason Afonso Henriquez wasn't too keen on being a vassal and declared his independence in 1138. But it wasn't until 1179 that Pope Alexander III recognized Portugal as an independent state. Okay, so now you know the history of Portugal. Now we can figure out how it became so stretched out. It started when the Crusader state of Edessa fell to the Seljuk Empire in the east on December 24, 1144. The Pope then called a crusade in retaliation, which would be the decision that would, unknowingly to the Pope, shape Portugal for the rest of time. Crusading armies passing by Afonso Henriquez Portugal on boat on the way to the Seljuks were bribed with cash if they helped conquer the strategic cities of Santarém and Lisbon from his Muslim neighbors in the south. Many then continued to the Holy Land except from the English who remained in Portugal and helped with Portugal's southward expansion. Afonso Henriquez was succeeded by his son Sancho I in 1185, who continued his father's expansionist policy. Sancho was dubbed the Populator because he promoted the resettlement of depopulated areas of Portugal, established new towns, and granted lands to bishops, religious orders, and nobles. But most notably, he captured Silves from the Great Almohad Caliphate, an important city in Algarve, in 1189, but then lost it 2 years later in 1191 after a counterattack by the Almohad Caliph. But in 1249 it was time to return to Algarve. This was done by Afonso III, the great-grandson Afonso Henriquez. He captured Faro, the capital of the Algarve, after a siege. The fall of Faro marked the end of Muslim resistance in Portugal, and Afonso III became the king of Portugal and Algarve. He also granted some privileges and lands to his loyal followers. But the Portuguese possession of the Algarve was not recognized by Castile until 1297, when the Treaty of Alcanizes was signed. The treaty also fixed the borders between Portugal and Castile and established a mutual alliance against their enemies. Afonso III moved his capital from Coimbra to Lisbon, reorganized his government, and created a parliament or cortes that represented the nobility, the clergy, and the townspeople. And by the end of the 13th century, Portugal had defined its long, outstretched, sausage-shaped border. There you have it, a short and simple description of why Portugal's border is so damn long. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing and liking to really help out the channel.